This is a special morning moment today. No intros, no fanfares, no nothing. This is about free speech in Canada. The Charter of Rights and Freedoms that we have in Canada protects us from dictators and tyrants. It's there to protect all Canadian citizens' right to free speech, the right for you to say what you want to say, the right for people to be heard, not just politicians, all of us. This piece today is probably the most serious piece I've ever done, and I really didn't think it would come so quickly after a general election. Please listen to this piece today and please pass it on to your friends. Canada is fighting for freedom as of February 3, 2020. Remember that date.
So how will this work? How are you going to regulate websites? How are you going to register all that? Do you buy these recommendations?
Well, one of the recommendations, so you're talking about a couple of different things here, but as far as the licensing is concerned, is if you're a distributor of content in Canada, and obviously, you know, if you're a very small media organization, the requirement probably wouldn't be the same as if you're Facebook or Google, so there would have to be some proportionality embedded into this, but we would ask that they have a license, yes.
So how will this work? How are you going to regulate websites? How are you going to register all?
That's just a taster of what's to come. This piece was brought to my attention by Canada Proud, which you can find on Twitter. Now, the reason I'm bringing you this piece is because of the little clip that they posted, which should be a warning almost from history of what Liberals are capable of in Canada. I wasn't here when the first Trudeau was in power, but this guy is beyond dangerous. I'll have much more to say about that later. The person who's being interviewed is, of course, from Montreal and is, of course, French. All of these comments and ideas undoubtedly come from Quebec and the Liberals. What I'm going to play for you today is the sound of the slipperiest character I've heard for a long time. You have to go all the way back to Goebbels to find anybody more insincere, and that's putting it politely. In particular, I'm going to play the whole piece. In particular, please listen to the last 30 seconds or so. Maybe you'll play it a couple of times. And this interview can be found, by the way, at CTV News website, and it's dated February 2, 2020. Comes from the programme called Question Period. The gentleman concerned is Stephen Gilbert. That's how I pronounce it. The so-called Heritage Minister. But listen very hard to the end of this interview, and I think you'll get an inkling of what these people really think about us, the real Canadians, and what they really want to do to us. I'll have much more on this and much more to say after this whole piece. I am playing the whole clip because I don't want to be accused of taking it out of context. If you listen to the piece, you will think it's quite innocuous at the beginning, but listen to those words very carefully and consider the ramifications before you dismiss it out of hand, like many people will. This is a very, very, very dangerous slope that we're going down in Canada. And surprisingly enough, this piece actually comes from one of the mainstream media channels. And this guy, who's interviewing him, is actually explaining what he thinks some of the consequences might be, unusually enough. Very rare for mainstream media in Canada. But I want you to listen to the whole piece. Forget the tax aspect. Listen to the whole piece.
Well, a battle is brewing between streaming sites and the Canadian government, and it could end up costing you more money and determining the news that you read. Look, a widespread review of Canada's broadcasting laws has come with 97 recommendations, including things like forcing sites like Netflix and Amazon Prime to not only pay GST or HST, but to contribute to developing Canadian content. It also wants to regulate websites and determine what a, quote, trusted news site really is. Is this protecting Canadian culture, or is this government overreach? Is it a backdoor version of the so-called Netflix tax or not? And would these costs just be passed on to you, the consumer? Let's find out. Heritage Minister Stephen Guilbeault joins me now. Minister, great to have you on the program. And I want to start with the elements about streaming services like Netflix, because that's in the popular lexicon. There are two sides to the recommendations. There seems to be widespread acceptance that companies like Netflix or Facebook should start paying GST/HST. But the panel wants to force them, as part of their licensing rules, to pay part of their revenue to Canadian content. Isn't that, sir, the Netflix tax by another name?
No, not at all. I mean, as far as the GST or HST, depending on where you are in the country, is concerned, it's about fairness. I mean, companies are paying GST in Canada, and there's no reason that some of the wealthiest companies in the world who are operating on Canadian soil shouldn't pay for it. In terms of asking them to do their fair share to contribute to Canadian cultural content, I mean, you were talking about Netflix. Well, last year Netflix spent around $1 billion in Canada. And what we would be asking them to do, what the panel is recommending, and what we have said as a government many times before, is that they take part of that money to invest it in the development and the distribution of Canadian cultural content. But we're not asking them to do more. We're asking them to take a part of what they're already doing here and dedicate it to Canadian content.
I get that, but that's essentially that's what the Netflix tax is, through the back door, not the front door, because it seems to me that they have to, as part of their licensing, if they're required to pay for Canadian content, don't they simply pass that on to the consumer and the consumer's price goes up? Isn't that kind of logical?
No, not at all. As I said, they are investing a lot of money in Canada right now. We're asking to take part of that money, to dedicate part of that money and to specific Canadian cultural content. We're not asking them to do more. We're asking them to take a part of what's being done here. And in fact, Netflix responded very favorably to recommendations from the panel, saying that they were ready to do their fair share.
What percentage?
In Canada.
So I'm because I know the creative community very much wants this. So you got your supporters on that. Others are saying, wait a second, it's unfair. The domestic companies that have to do that, they already get a lot of benefits from the closed system and the regulations here in Canada. They get other benefits, bundling service, etc. These companies are saying, why should we have to pay the same kind of CanCon fees as they do?
Well, the reality is that the Canadian system is in part funded by ad revenues, and these ad revenues in Canada are going down because companies like Google and Facebook are now taking about 90% of those ad revenues in the country. So in the coming years, if nothing is done, they will be hundreds of millions, maybe close to $1 billion less money available for Canadian content. So we need to find a way to correct this, and asking those companies that are making lots of money in Canada to take part of that money and dedicate it to Canadian content is only asking them to do their fair share.
Okay, and then I guess you haven't decided on the percentage. Let me talk about the scope of this new regulatory body, the new regime. In order to make Canadian content what they call discoverable, easy to access, there'll be the imposition of requirements on what you guys call sharers or aggregators, content creators. And I'm going to read you what it says in the report. Links to the websites of Canadian sources of, quote, accurate, trusted, and reliable sources of news with a view to ensuring the diversity of voices. Question, sir. Who will determine what trusted news sources are? The government? Is it appropriate for the government to determine what's a trusted news source?
First thing I have to say is this is a panel that was created by our government in 2018. They went across the country. They've met hundreds of people, experts. They've received close to 2,000 submissions as part of their work. And these are recommendations for the government. As you said initially, there's 97 of these recommendations. So it's not the government of Canada saying this is what we're going to do. This panel is making recommendations to us, and we will be studying these recommendations very closely. I've heard some people say that, oh my God, the government is going to decide what we see on the web. Hold on a second. Canada is not about to take over the World Wide Web. That's not what we're talking about here, not at all.
Yeah, but sir, to be fair, you've got an agency that wants to enhance its scope of powers to determine what's a trusted news source. So the first question will be, who's to define that? You've got a lot of these groups.
This is a recommendation, Evan.
Okay,
it's
but the
CRTC hasn't decided.
Okay,
anything.
But they're recommending that. They're recommending that content providers have to register and get a license. So how will this work? How are you going to regulate websites? How are you going to register all that? Do you buy these recommendations?
Well, one of the recommendations, so you're talking about a couple of different things here, but as far as the licensing is concerned, is if you're a distributor of content in Canada, and obviously, if you're a very small media organization, the requirement probably wouldn't be the same as if you're Facebook or Google. So there would have to be some proportionality embedded into this. But we would ask that they have a license, yes. Just like right now, but with the old system in Canada, distributors needed to go to the CRTC and to have a license. Now, specifically, how would that be done? Again, this is one of a number of recommendations made by this panel. We will be studying them very, very closely, and we have said we would table a bill by the end of the year, but we haven't certainly made up our mind on these elements. We are studying the report very closely. It was handed to me a few days ago, so I'm still going through it right now.
Right. Okay, so here's another concern. I'll just raise some of these red flags. There's a concern that the panel wants to regulate international companies as well. So let me take an example of a controversial site like Breitbart. How would the government force a company like Breitbart, the New York Times, Mother Jones, the Daily Mail, how would they force those companies to comply with rules of Canadian content, discoverability? And if they don't comply, what happens? Will Canadians be blocked from accessing international sites?
I don't think that's what's recommended in the report, that these sites be blocked in Canada. I'm not sure I see what the big deal is. I mean, we have an incredible number of international corporations that are operating in Canada in all sorts of sectors, in the financial sector, in the construction sector, in the energy sector, and these companies comply with Canadian rules and laws. We're a sovereign state, and what is true of Canada is true of the United States, and it's true of France and Great Britain and Japan. So we're not asking these companies to do this extraordinary things that no other companies have been asked to do before. We're asking them to simply abide by the rules and regulations that we have in our country.
But Minister, digital world is different than shipping logs. And you know that. I mean, this is the thing is, Canadians have free access to all sorts of international companies that are not based here through the internet. And the proposal here is to regulate those international companies and subject them to the laws. I guess my question is, how the heck will you enforce those regulations?
Well, I think what is being proposed by the panel is that if you distribute content in Canada, that there is some ways by which some regulatory body, right now the regulatory body that would do that is the CRTC. But we are seeing regulations and laws like these ones being developed all around the world. It's happening in Europe right now. It's happening in other countries as well. So it wouldn't be something. It's true that not so many countries have done so. That is correct. But Canada wouldn't be the first country in the world to do that. And again, we haven't made any decisions in terms of how this is going to be done and what exactly we're going to be doing.
All right, I got to leave it there. Minister Guilbeault, great to have you on the program, sir. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Evan.
Under the guise of fairness, which you'll hear so often, which is the watchword of socialists, they think it's okay to regulate what you see and hear on the internet in Canada. They call it a license. I call it regulation. How can they regulate content not produced in Canada? The answer is very simple. They can limit access Canadians have to foreign content. Trudeau, let me make it perfectly clear. We Canadians know that you look at China with envious eyes, how they control social media and the internet in general, and you see a model that can be applied to reduce and eliminate any criticism of your regime. The problem you face, as do all politicians, is that annoying thing called the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Oh yes, you try and nibble away at the edges, as do all politicians in this country, but at its core is individual freedom. This is a warning, yes, a warning to you and your party. If you think a group of so-called informed citizens will allow you to determine what we Canadians see and hear or say or do in Canada, then, Mr. Prime Minister, you will reap a whirlwind, the likes of which this country has never seen before, because we have a charter, and if you're not intending to honour it, then why the hell should we? And then all bets are off, aren't they? Canada does not live in isolation in the world, and if you think you can cut Canadians off from it, from freedom of thought, freedom of speech, freedom of belief, freedom of association, in short, Mr. Trudeau, freedom, then you're in for the biggest fight this country has ever seen. We will not stand idly by. We will not see our rights taken away from us. There will be fights in the House of Commons and elsewhere, and there are far more of us than you, and we have many, many, many more friends outside of Canada ready and willing to support us. You will never know who's coming into our country, not just the ones who support your perverted ideals, but those who also are coming to protect our freedom. They will be outside journalists. They will be outside reporters. They will be outside commentators. And your thoughts, deeds and actions will be exposed to the world. We will fight you at the ballot box and in the media, at home and abroad. We promise you, you will never have a free day to yourself. Because, Mr. Trudeau, it's we the people, Mr. Trudeau, we the people, not the elite who govern this country. And you do well to remember that. You can find more at aradio.wordpress.com, where you can find links to us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Gab, Spotify and email. We're on Spotify under the podcast section. Type in Canadian Politics with a twist and you'll find us. We are continuing to reach out to you, so please pass these links on to your friends. Please click on the follow button on Spreaker.com. You can listen to all our morning moments at Spreaker.com/aradio. EHRADIO, a radio. And please click on the like button. Join us Monday, Wednesday and Friday at 11:45 Eastern, and tell your friends and pass the word. We only tell the truth, not what the mainstream media want you to know.